Hey, I'm Stephanie, and it's time to talk new makeup. Well, makeup that was new to me this summer anyway. Today I'll be sharing my final thoughts and reviews of several different things, including the Lancome La Base Pro Primer, Haus Labs Triclone Skin Tech Foundation, 4 of the eyeshadows from Chantecaille's limited edition 2023 release of their Wild Mustang collection, and these Maybelline Superstay Matte Ink liquid lipsticks. Most of the items we're focusing on today were simply on loan to me from friends or family, meaning that part of the review today will answer the ultimate question: now that I've had time to extensively test these products, do I actually want to go out and spend my own money on them? As always, I'll leave timestamps in the show notes so you can simply hop, skip, and jump to whatever's most relevant for you. And now we're going to jump right in. When it comes to reviews, I think it's always good to begin with a little bit of context because the way that makeup performs often has a lot to do with our skin type. So my skin type is true combination skin. The skin directly under my eyes is pretty dry, whereas the skin in the rest of the center of my face is pretty darn oily, especially in the summer when I was testing these things. The skin on my eyelids is extremely oily in a way that repels most products, whereas the skin on the outskirts of my face is pretty normal. So keep that in mind as you're listening to these reviews, especially if you are trying to figure out whether or not to buy a product. If you happen to have a different skin type than I do, you might want to kind of take those things into account as you're making that decision. Now let's get into the products, going in order of application, so starting with primer. When I posted that a friend had loaned me a bottle of Lancome La Base Pro Primer to try, several of you messaged me saying that you really liked it, but that you'd also like to know my thoughts. And I was very optimistic because you guys have impeccable taste. So I tried it out and I can see why so many of you like it. The packaging was very convenient with a pump that allowed me to pump out just the right amount of product for each application. It was cosmetically elegant and I could see a smoothing effect under both the Haus Labs Triclone foundation I was testing and my tried and tested Estee Lauder Double Wear Stay in Place makeup. I really enjoyed testing this primer, but in the end, I decided that the smoothing effect wasn't impactful enough for me to warrant putting an extra layer of product on my face. I have really large pores, especially in the center where I'm at my oiliest, and I just felt like the smoothing effect, although it was visible, I think it might have only been visible to me, maybe to another makeup wearer, but I'm not sure that like anyone else would have been like,
"Oh, your skin looks amazingly smooth."
And I don't know, I kind of feel like if I'm going to use a smoothing primer, that's the effect I want. I don't know if there's a primer out there that does that, but that's what I imagine that I want from a primer. So that was one strike against it. The other strike against it was that I do feel like the oils from my skin broke through my foundation faster whenever I was using the primer. And that meant that I had to put more powder on, and with my makeup preferences being what they are, I prefer the most natural, weightless complexion possible. And so adding layers of powder over and over again isn't ideal for me. So ultimately, I think this primer is really nice. It's just not necessarily made for me and my skin type, at least not in the summer. Moving on to complexion, the Haus Labs Triclone Skin Tech Foundation, on the other hand, was a real hit. A friend lent me her bottle and I did a whole video with my first impressions. And I'm going to link that in the show notes because everything I discovered in those first impressions ended up ringing true throughout the entire testing process. So if you want a lot of detailed information, I'll let you watch that video. I'll just summarize that video really quickly here and then move on to some of the new discoveries I made as I tested out over time. What I discovered during that first impressions was that that foundation almost acts like a very gentle perfecting filter. It makes your skin look really natural. You don't see any foundation sitting on the skin, but it does cover redness and minor blemishes. However, it did leave some dark spots and blemishes that could still be seen. But you have to keep in mind, I tend to use very little foundation when I'm applying my makeup. At the most, I usually apply a half a pump for my entire face. When I did apply more just for testing purposes, I did get get more coverage, but never enough to completely cover the dark spots. So I would say it's definitely a medium coverage foundation. While I was trying the Haus Labs Foundation, I tested 4 different application methods using my fingers, using a dry sponge, using a wet sponge, and using a brush. Now, I am not typically a fan of using my phalanges to apply makeup just because it's not normally very practical for me. Many times when I'm applying my makeup, it's not in a bathroom. It's in a different type of room. I don't know, a backstage room, a closet, somewhere, not a bathroom. And that means that I have to get up and physically go to a different room to wash my hands to get the foundation off. So it's not my method of choice to apply foundations, but I honestly feel like that was the best way. That's when I got the best results for my preferences, because I got the most matte results that lasted the longest throughout the day. And it looked best on my nose when I used my fingers. So that was, for me, the number one way to apply it. But luckily, the close second method was using a dry beauty sponge. And when I did that, I got almost as good of coverage and longevity. So I would say for someone with my preferences, if you like a natural matte finish, either using your fingers or a dry beauty sponge is going to give you that finish. Using a wet sponge, the finish looked beautiful, but it was just very dewy, and that just was a disaster for the longevity on my skin. When I used the wet sponge, I got like maybe an hour of wear, and then the foundation was just completely gone on my nose. Whereas when I used my fingers or a dry beauty sponge, then I could wear it all day without a problem. So using a wet sponge looks beautiful, but it's just not feasible for me. However, the friend of mine who lent me the foundation has a very different skin type than I do. It's much drier than mine. She doesn't have oily skin. And when she applies that foundation with a wet sponge, it looks gorgeous on her. So I think you might have to play with it a little bit. As for the brush method, I felt like that was okay. It wasn't the best, but it wasn't the worst. I did feel, though, that the foundation would kind of gather in my larger pores on the sides of my nose and in the center of my face when I used the brush. And that didn't happen when I used my fingers, and it really didn't happen when I used the dry beauty sponge. So to sum it up, when it comes to application, using your fingers or a dry beauty sponge are going to give you the most matte finish, and that's going to possibly give you the most longevity. If you use a wet sponge, you get a beautiful dewy finish, but if you have an oily skin type, then that might harm the longevity a bit. And if you use a brush, I mean, it could look great, but for me, I have very large pores because I have oily skin, and that just meant that the foundation would get stuck in my pores. When it comes to the longevity, I do think it's worth providing an update here, because in my first impressions video, I wasn't sure if I saw maybe some fading or patchiness on my chin, and that is an area that I touch a lot during the day, because when I'm working, I do this sort of thing all the time. And so I was kind of worried because it looked like the foundation was fading here, that maybe it was because I'd been touching my face. But no, that was just user error. On that day, I just didn't apply very much foundation to my chin, and so that's why there wasn't much coverage there. Every other day, when I applied my foundation evenly, I didn't have any problem with the foundation fading, as long as I didn't use a wet sponge. But as I said, that has to do with my skin type more than anything else. All in all, I felt like the Haus Labs Triclone foundation wore beautifully throughout the whole day, as long as I applied it with my fingers or a dry sponge. And it even stuck to my nose, which is a miracle in my book, because hardly any foundations managed to do that. So this foundation had great longevity on my skin, the perfect amount of coverage for my preferences, and a beautiful natural finish. I liked it so much that I even went into Sephora and shade matched myself. And just for reference, my perfect shade seems to be 160. So the question now is, am I gonna get it? Right now? No. Because project panning has taught me that it takes me so long to go through one bottle of foundation, and I currently already have 2 formulas that I really enjoy. Plus, foundation for me is more of a utilitarian product. It's not like color cosmetics like eyeshadow or blush where I really enjoy having a variety, I kind of just like to have my go-tos that just work for me. So I don't necessarily feel the need to have a bunch of different formulas at my fingertips all the time. But I would consider purchasing it if I finish up one of the bottles that I already have. To be honest, I would have loved to have been able to test the Haus Labs Foundation in direct comparison with my Giorgio Armani Luminous Silk Foundation, because that's the one that it would replace coverage-wise and finish-wise. So if you have any experience with both of those foundations, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Moving on to color cosmetics, I also had the opportunity to try some Chantecaille single eyeshadows. I did do a detailed review of 2 of the luminescent eye shades from their permanent line, so I will link that below. But even more exciting, I had the opportunity to only very briefly try all four of the limited edition 2023 Wild Mustang collection eyeshadows. The fall line consists of 2 new luminescent eye shades and 2 matte eyeshadows in a pressed gel formula. When it comes to the luminescent eye shades in the fall collection, they're not quite as sparkly as the ones in their permanent line. I swatched Chantecaille's Wild Mustang luminescent eyeshadows next to some of the luminescent eye shades from their permanent line. The 2 center shades on my hand are from the Wild Mustang collection. The top center shade is Roan, the bottom one is Pinto. I compared Roan to the Giraffe and Lion shades. Roan leads just a tad warm, but I think you can see it's much less saturated than Giraffe or Lion. And although it is sparkly, Roan is more of a satin eyeshadow with just a pinch of fairy dust. I swatched Pinto next to Pangolin and Elephant from the permanent line, and I feel like the silvery mauve of Pinto sits perfectly in between the dusty lilac of Pangolin and the shimmering taupe gray of Elephant. The shade Pinto, which is the cooler of the 2 luminescent eye shades, it does have different colored sparklies in it, so it does have something a little bit magical, but it's not quite as textured or as multi-dimensional as the permanent line, so it doesn't have quite as much shine. Roan, which is the warmer kind of cinnamon colored luminescent eye shade in the fall line, ends up actually having a satin finish. I mean, when I swatched it out on a flat surface like the back of my hand, and if I look at it in direct sunlight, you can definitely see that there's sparkly particles in the formula. But once I applied that formula to my eye, the effect was that of a satin, and it was beautiful. It just wasn't necessarily super special. The matte shades, on the other hand, really surprised me. Now, don't get me wrong, I love a good matte eyeshadow, but typically, I don't know, sparkly shades just hold more magic for me, probably because they remind me of fairy dust and shooting stars. But these mattes, they intrigued me. They're in Chantecaille's gel powder formula, which is a new to me formula in makeup because it is a gel, but it's a powder. And it doesn't feel like a gel, but it doesn't feel like a powder either. It just kind of feels like nothing. It almost feels like you're just rubbing a very, very hard pressed silky powder. And it feels like because it's so hard pressed, nothing's going to come off on your finger. But then you look and it's just chock full of color. It's just like really saturated and you're like, whoa, where did that come from? And the finish is almost like wet looking because it has like a pearlescence to it, but it feels completely dry. In fact, it feels like nothing. It's just completely weightless. And as someone who is starting to notice changes in the texture and firmness of the skin on my eyelids, the idea of a completely weightless, slightly pearlescent matte formula is pretty darn intriguing to me. And the very few times that I had the opportunity to wear them on my eyes, they just looked and felt completely weightless. And it was amazingly flattering. So much so that they even impressed me more than the luminescent shades. So if I were to buy any of the shadows from this limited edition line, I would actually lean more towards the mattes. In fact, I think if I could only pick one shadow from the line, it would probably be Palomino. I know, the boring cream color, what can I say? But when I was trying out these shadows, that one just seemed perfect. For me anyway, because it applied beautifully with my fingers, but also with a brush. It did a great job of evening out the discoloration that I have on my eyelids. On my skin tone, it was the perfect shade to add just the right amount of brightness to my deep set eyes, and it didn't crease. even on my oily eyelids. That alone is impressive. Plus, it even worked as a primer for other eyeshadows. Plus, it felt more lightweight than any of my normal cream primers that I typically use, like my MAC Paint Pot in Soft Ochre or my Laura Mercier Caviar Stick in the shade Vanilla Kiss. I mean, it was a dream, a very utilitarian dream, but a dream nonetheless. It's a true workhorse of a product. My second favorite shadow was probably Pinto. That's the silvery mauve luminescent eye shade. And although that shade isn't quite as sparkly as the shades in the permanent line, there is something very multidimensional about the color itself, the way it shifts between warm and cool. And it still has that little bit of sparkle in it, like someone just threw a little bit of fairy dust in there. So it's definitely magical in its own way. As much as I think the shade Roan is beautiful and probably the luminescent shade in this collection that's most suited to my skin tone, on the eye, it just kind of ends up looking like a satin eyeshadow. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it looks beautiful. But as someone who already has a very large eyeshadow collection, I don't feel like that particular shade would add a whole lot of value to what I already have. And that dark brown matte shadow in the collection, Bay, is gorgeous. And I would love it if I had it. I mean, it looks like melted chocolate on the skin. So yummy. But if I were to be strategic, and as a price-sensitive customer, I do have to be strategic when weighing all of the beautiful things that I would love to buy, then this would be the last shade out of the collection that I would purchase. And my reasoning behind that is, I suspect that this gel powder formula is the same formula that they also use in their bronzers. Meaning that if I were to not get this limited edition color, yes, I would be giving up my opportunity to wear this particular shade of weightless chocolate on my eyelids. But I would be able to try the formula at a later date in a different shade of brown in the bronzer, and that would make me feel less like I'm missing out. If I wasn't being strategic, then maybe Bay would be the second favorite shadow in the collection for me. I don't know, it's hard to say. I think it's tied with Pinto. I'm becoming a matte maven over here. What is Chantecaille doing to me? So, am I going to buy any of these? As tempting as they are, I don't think so, because I already have so many beautiful shadows. Take, for instance, this shadow that I just purchased earlier this year. It's Dior's Beige Mitza Single Shadow. And I had been lusting after this ever since it came out. And now that it's discontinued, I found it on clearance. So I have been absolutely loving this shadow. It's what I have on my eyes today. And I feel like it sits kind of in between the two luminescent shades from the Chantecaille line. And so this shade scratches that itch. As for the matte shadows, I honestly don't have anything like them, and that makes them super tempting. But that is just in reference to the formula, not the colors. I definitely already have those colors several times over in other very luxurious formulas. So I am going to resist temptation by simply enjoying the browns and beiges that I already have. And lastly, let's talk lips with the Maybelline Superstay Matte Ink Liquid Lipsticks. These were decluttered to me in the shade 10 Dreamer and 60 Poet, and a couple of you had requested a review, so here it is. It's a relatively comfortable formula in the sense that it isn't really drying like a lot of liquid lipsticks out there are, but it is sticky. Now, when I say sticky, I don't mean in the sense of a gloss. Like if I were to put a gloss on and then go out on a windy day and my hair blew onto my lips, it would stick there like glue. And these aren't sticky in that sense, but they do make my lips stick to each other, which isn't really an ideal sensation, at least not for me. But these aren't the stickiest that I've ever experienced. I feel like the NYX liquid lipsticks were worse. But if I really need a liquid lipstick that's going to wear all day, I have to say this goes pretty strong. First of all, it survives the kiss test. I'm wearing it on my lips now, and when I kiss my hand, there's a little something there, but that is the liner that I'm wearing. I'm wearing a lip liner around here, and that's what that's from. So once it dries down, this does not transfer. I have only really been testing this during normal activities. So, I ate and drank normally, and I found that it lasted a good 4 hours before I saw any fading, but that fading was minimal and it was even. Around 6 hours, I noticed a little bit more, but I think I would still be the only person who really noticed it fading. Around hour 8, I felt like other people might start to notice it fading, and by hour 10, it had clearly faded, but every time I noticed it fading, it was fading evenly, which is a good advantage because, I mean, normally if you really needed to, you could reapply. But most importantly, I never got that nasty, crusty, flaking effect that I've gotten with some liquid lipsticks in the past. Do you know what I'm talking about? When it's almost like the lipstick starts to come off in like really awkward, gross chunks. Yeah, that didn't happen with these, so that was good. And it's probably because this formula isn't dehydrating like a lot of other formulas are. The application method I found that worked best to both reduce that sticky effect while maintaining longevity was to apply one very generous swipe to the center of my bottom lip and then take my finger or a brush and really spread the product out over the rest of my lips, making sure to really work it into the skin before it dried down. And that ensured that I got a thin, even layer of coverage across all the nooks and crannies of my lips. So, do I think these are worth keeping? I don't know. And the reason is because of the color. I'm not necessarily sure these are colors I would wear. This is the one, Poet, that I'm wearing on my lips today. And I'd actually like to know what you think, because every single time I put this shade on, I thought, oh, that's a little bit light. And so every single time I've worn this, I've added a darker lip liner to add just a little bit of definition to my lips. And that's also what I did today. So I don't know, you tell me, because you know how sometimes you wear a color you're not used to and you think it looks weird because you're not used to it, but like other people are like, oh, that looks great on you. Like, I don't know, maybe this is that case, or maybe it just really is too light for me. I don't know. I'll let you decide. Let me know in the comments. Okay, but these colors aside, would I consider purchasing this formula in a different color? And the answer is maybe, but not right now, because I'm not super into liquid lipsticks as a formula, and I generally only wear liquid lipsticks when I'm on stage. And at the moment, I do still have a couple of KVD Beauty lipsticks in my stage bag, and that's what I tend to use on stage, and I'm not necessarily in need or in the market for another liquid lipstick at the moment. But if one of those were to run out, I would definitely consider replacing it with a shade from the Maybelline range. But I'm actually pretty curious because a lot of times I wear like a deeper, darker red when I'm on stage. And I'm wondering how the darker shades of this hold up, because I don't know about you, but sometimes I have a lipstick formula that I really like, and then I try it in a darker color, and all of a sudden it's the longevity isn't as good, or it's kind of patchy in the application. So I would be curious, have you tried these in a darker shade? Because if you have, I would love to hear about your experience in the comments. If you are still watching, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. If you found this video helpful or entertaining, please consider giving it a thumbs up, commenting, subscribing, all that jazz. But even if you don't, I hope you have a great week and that we can all remember that even stumbling can be a form of moving forward. So let's stumble in style.